Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I am with Dr. Richard Carrier, joining me again after a couple of years. Hey, Dr. Carrier.
Yeah,
Nice to
hey.
meet you.
Nice to be here.
All right, today we're going to get into why naturalism is the best explanation for the world. You have a couple of books you wrote about this, Sense and Goodness and Why I'm Not a Christian, and both of them I think are kind of two of the best, really. I read them more than once, and they're very good. So,
oh, thanks. Yeah, yeah. For people who don't know, Why I'm Not a Christian is a book I was paid to write. A fan of mine, a patron, said he wanted the book that sort of had the definitive reason why I reject Christianity, and wanted that title. And so, and it's a short little book; it's like 90 pages at most. But it really just summarizes the points. I crafted it specifically to respond to what I know all the rebuttals are, right? So like you say, well, the God is silent. And then you know what all the Christians, what their rebuttals are to that, because they have these stock answers. And so I wrote it in a way that those stock answers don't work anymore. But big underlying feature of that is the fact that naturalism is a much more plausible explanation of what we observe to be the case, including the divine hiddenness, right? Including silence of God. That's entirely predicted by the fact that there is just a natural world and no God. And then Sense of Goodness Without God, though, that's the book with the subtitle is A Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism. That's where I lay out, like, this is what we should believe in, not just what we shouldn't believe in, not just what we should doubt, but also what our positive beliefs should be. And I organize it as naturalism as a comprehensive worldview, which is, I think, what you want to talk about today.
Yeah. So would you make a distinction between naturalism and physicalism or materialism? Or how would you define naturalism exactly?
Right. Well, physicalism would be a subcategory of naturalism. It's at least theoretically possible for a non-physicalist naturalism. I don't buy it, but there's not really an evidence for it. Materialism, the word materialism has become obsolete now because we know matter and energy are interchangeable, and a lot of it is not a solid material, right? So like photons are not a material, but they are a physical thing and have physical properties, wavelength and energy and even mass, really. They have zero rest mass, but they have relativistic mass and so on. So they're physical properties. So we've switched to physicalism, saying only physical things exist. And then the question is, how do you explain consciousness? And our explanation, the physicalist explanation, is that it is just what happens when you have a certain kind of information processing, physical information processing. So you have a physical brain, operates in a certain way, and it just is experienced the way we experience it. And so there really isn't any extra stuff, right? So it's all physical all the way down at the bottom of everything. That's physicalism, and that is inherently, by definition, a form of naturalism. Naturalism being there's nothing supernatural. And people often ask, like, what's the difference between the supernatural and the natural? And my take on this, and I have noticed this is pretty much the way everybody acts, whether they define it this way or not, is that a supernatural thing is when you have some mental property, a mind, a thought, an emotion, that does not reduce to physical underlying causes. And you can give many examples of this. God is a classic example of this. Has no body, right? Just a disembodied mind. That would be a supernatural thing by definition. The naturalism is there's no mental stuff except as caused and produced entirely by non-mental stuff, by physical things. So, and I would say non-mental stuff gives you the broader possibility of non-physicalist naturalisms. I haven't seen any of those that really work out very well. Like there's a form of Platonism that's naturalistic Platonism, for example, that posits a realm of, abstract ideas or something like that, that would be definitely supernatural, except for the fact that it has no causal function. So I don't find this plausible. I think physicalism is a much better explanation of everything.
Would you say something like ghosts could potentially fit into, naturalism as being what exists as a natural world? Because ghosts could be energy or something. It's just that we don't have good evidence for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I call things like that paranormal rather than supernatural, because you can have a ghost that is supernatural in that it's just a mind or it just has powers or whatever. It doesn't reduce to physical properties.
Right.
But if it actually is just made of some stuff, ectoplasm, and this was just another body that has different properties than other bodies, then yeah, it would be just another natural entity that we could then scientifically study and explore. It's just obvious, like you said, we found no evidence of this being the case. So so the reason we reject it is not because naturalism is true, but because there's just no evidence for that kind of thing.
What percentage of philosophers and scientists nowadays are naturalists? It's pretty high, right?
It is. Gosh, there's a new poll that just came out. So there's the Phil Papers survey, and they did I can't remember the last one, but it's about 5-10 years ago. And then now they have the 2022 or the 2020 Phil Papers survey. It was 2009 and 2020, where they polled all philosophers. So not scientists, but philosophers at least. And a lot of those philosophers are evangelical Christian apologists nonetheless, but it's still a small percentage. And naturalism is pretty high. I'd have to go check the numbers to see how many are naturalists, but it is well above 50%. Of philosophers, right? And then when you go to scientists are even more naturalistic than philosophers generally. So the percentage is much higher than that, I would suspect. And usually if you look at things like polls of belief in God, certain kinds of physicists, belief in God is very low. So you're in the vicinity of like 90% atheists, and those are almost entirely naturalists. I mean, it would be highly unusual for any of them not to be.
So, I mean, that says something, right? That the people that are kind of most in touch with reality, either studying it empirically or, thinking it through very deeply and systematically, they don't buy,
Right. And particularly the more in touch you are with fundamentals of reality. So physicists versus doctors, for example. Or even more like nurses. So if you look at belief in God, it goes up when you go from physics to biology, and it goes up even more when you go from biology specifically to medicine, and it goes up even more when you go from doctors to nurses, right? So like the more education you have in the fundamental nature of reality, the less you believe in it, that God is a plausible explanation of anything. And I think the reason is because the more you really understand the underlying nature of how reality works, God is a terrible explanation. Like you realize like the physicalism is a much better explanation for everything, including like statistics, like randomness, the way probability plays out in completely non-mentally controlled systems explains everything that we observe, right? So whereas what we observe does not fit the pattern you would see if there was some sort of intentional agent who was actually interested and involved in any of it, right? So yeah, the more in touch you are with the fundamental basis of reality, especially the statistical foundations of reality, the less you find God or even the supernatural at all as a plausible explanation for things.
What do you make of the utter endurance of spirituality in terms of, focusing it on a deity of some kind or some type of religion, even among, today, many professions, like you were just mentioning, pretty educated people, even maybe not the most educated, but still it's endured for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
You think it has to do more with like the intuition that we have? Do we feel like we have a separate spirit or mind and body? And, a lot of the findings of science are counterintuitive because we didn't necessarily evolve to intuit them. We didn't need to for survival.
Yeah. So there's two components to this, right? There's what you're referring to, which is the evolved biological, neurological basis for it. And there's been a lot of work on this. Daniel Dennett summarizes a lot of this science in, Breaking the Spell, his book, Breaking the Spell, where he summarizes existing science of religion, psychology of religion, sociology of religion, anthropology of religion. These are all well-established fields of study and have learned a lot of things about why people believe the things that they believe. And so there's a lot of factors that are actually part of the way our brains are not very well designed. They're prone to errors of intuition, and they're prone to ones that just happen to create supernaturalist beliefs. And a classic example is agency over detection, right? So there's our brains have evolved a tendency to oversee intentional agency in the world. So we think maybe somebody's controlling the wind, somebody's controlling the rain. right? So this idea that there's minds controlling everything, and then of course if you start aggregating all of those minds, you go from animism to theism. You say, well, there must be one mind controlling all of this stuff. But the reason we evolved that error is that under detecting agency. So the classic example is like you hear a rustle in the grass behind you, and if you just dismiss that as the wind, but it's not the wind, it's someone hunting you, well then you're dead, right? Whereas if it is the wind and you turn and look to investigate, and you just believe that, oh well, there's just an animated spirit that's not hunting me, that doesn't kill you, right? So it's actually over detection, seeing agency where it doesn't exist, is less harmful to us in differential reproductive success than under detecting it. And so so that's an example of how our brains have evolved to make mistakes. But they're mistakes that are designed for, or mistakes that have been selected for making us more capable of survival, more capable of defending ourselves against threats. But the side effect of this is that we start to believe that spirits inhabit everything, or the spirits inhabit everything, right? Like there's one spirit or whatever. Belief in ghosts comes in the same idea. That it's the same kind of agency over detection malfunction in our brain that leads to belief in ghosts and so on. And the other half of it, though, is culture, right? So if you look at cultures, what do different cultures do with this? So our idea, we're used to the West, we're used to the Western tradition of theism, which is really weird. It's actually a very strange version of religion in terms of the global anthropology of religion, but it has dominated the world because Western imperialism, right? So we think that that's the norm, but that's actually a very unusual religion, this idea of one God controlling everything, and then the idea of scriptures being relevant to that. Like, these are all very strange religious developments that are very late in the history of human beings, right? So it's like we came up with this stuff pretty late on. Religion used to be for tens of thousands of years. Actually, we have evidence over 100,000 years. Used to be animistic, polytheistic, and so on. It was very different. It wasn't scripture-based. It was shaman-based, right? So shamans were the foundation of religion,
and it was like cyclical, right?
That was an example, right? Is tying it into nature, very much nature-oriented, astrological oriented, and so on. Now it's much more civilization, empires, and dominance related, right? So God is now much more interested in your toilet habits and who you have sex with, and all of this. So these are all social control mechanisms, and so these are actually attributing all these powers to God is actually at one of the negative side effects of civilization, that people want to control other people, and so religion has become a tool for that. But that wasn't the legacy of religion through most of its history.
It doesn't really make sense that there's a mind that's disembodied, that just existed forever or outside of time. What was it doing in what space?
Right.
Could there be something that's counterintuitive out there that could be something like a God? Because even if it doesn't make sense, and everything we know up to now, and we definitely have to go based off like what we know, or else if you don't, like you can just believe anything, right? Faith, you can believe anything.
Right.
So that's definitely where you want to start. But isn't it possible, like, you don't want to commit the black swan fallacy? There could be something counterintuitive that is like a God.
Yeah, I mean, lots of things are conceivable, right? So the question is, what would the thing that you're conceiving, what would it predict we would observe if it existed, and what would happen? What would we observe if it didn't exist? And then you go and look at the differential evidence. And so the one thing we've gotten to the point now, certainly by now, when we're talking the 21st century, right? We've been hundreds of years of really intense, well-invested scientific investigation into the nature of the world and the contents of the world and so on. It's very clear that there's no universal agent who's involving itself in human history at all, right? So there's no one talking to us, no one involving itself in human history. So if you were to posit some other conceivable, let's say godlike entity, they have to be so far away and so either completely disinterested in us or don't even know we exist, right? Which is entirely possible. Like, you could think of like some ultra advanced AI from a previous billions of years ago civilization has reached the point of being essentially a god, right? In terms of, Arthur C. Clarke godlike powers, right? It's just, at a certain level of technology, the Clarke's law says magic becomes indistinguishable from technology. I think that's only true at the surface level. In the underlying mechanics, they are very much distinguishable, magic and technology. Technology always has a mechanical underlying basis. And magic is something that just happens. You say, you just say it and then it happens, right? There's no intervening mechanism that makes it happen. So you could imagine these technological gods, right? These kinds of like super AIs, super aliens or something like that.
Simulation theory. I mean, if we're in a simulation, could you say that our simulators, our creators, are godlike, at least in comparison?
Right. Yeah. No, we absolutely would say that, right? So if we were in a sim, the creators of the sim are essentially functionally gods, right? They're not exactly identical to the omni disembodied God that Christians want there to exist, but they would nevertheless be a god by the definition of any religion, of most religions throughout human history, right? Most gods throughout human history that people have imagined have been limited gods, right? Embodied gods usually, right? So yeah, in terms of like the broader definition of a god, Simverse management would be divine in that sense. Now that doesn't mean that they would be cool. They might be awful people, right? So there's often this immediate assumption that gods must be good, but they might have no moral character whatsoever or a malevolent one. So yeah, these things are conceivable, but they entail predictions generally, and we just don't observe it. So an example in the case of the sim theory, there's very little reason to suspect that anybody who could create a sim like this would waste their resources on this kind of sim. Whereas we're talking about what Nick Bostrom would call an ancestor sim, where you're just recreating the horrors of human history, the Holocaust and everything else. I mean, first of all, you have to be massively unethical to even want to do this. And secondly, there'd be no point in doing it. It wouldn't serve any purpose. If you had the ability to create simverses, what you're going to have are all games and paradises, right? So if there was a sim world and we were in it, we would be either in a video game essentially, or we would be in a paradise of some form, because those are the only kinds of well,
unless somebody wanted to recreate, like, I don't know, Matrix style, some type of.
But why, right? So, right. Notice you have to come up with some elaborate reason why they would do this, which is what reduces the probability of that being the case. It's the same as trying to come up with an elaborate reason why God doesn't talk to us or doesn't show himself or anything like that.
And a simulation can still fit within the naturalism framework, because those.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So if we were in a sim, that would still be naturalism. In fact, that would be even more obviously naturalism than theism.
It definitely seems like the universe works kind of bottom up. Things evolve. They start off simpler. And if you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing, and you posit God, all that does is pretty much shift things from the universe. Who created God? Where did God come? God existed forever. Okay, the universe could have existed forever. Like, physicists think it did.
Yeah. You're explaining one thing by an even more complicated and less probable thing, which is a terrible form of explanation. I just did a blog recently on one of the underlying assumptions of, for example, the fine-tuning argument. Is that in order to explain apparent fine-tuning, the way the gravitational constant, for example, is the way it is, and so on, allows life to arise in the universe. Now, we have lots of naturalistic explanations for this that are actually more plausible and more evidence-based than theism. But the thing with theism is what they're doing is you have this, what you think is a lucky accident, right? So, we've got to explain this lucky accident. And then they pose, well, there's this amazing, super specific, hyper-specific God who just exists for no reason and has done all this stuff and then does it in a particular way and so on. It's like, well, now you're posing even greater luck. Like, we would have to be even more lucky for that God to just exist, right? For us to have that God in the universe or in existence at all entails much more luck than just getting a lucky universe that naturalistically produces people. So
some of them have arguments like God is actually simple somehow. I
right.
read those. I don't buy any of those. But,
the Swinburne, right? Swinburne tried this, right? He tries to argue that God is simple, but it doesn't make sense. It actually isn't true by any measure of simplicity in actual scientific theories, which is theoretical simplicity. There's two ways to do it. One is component simplicity, like how many things do you have to make up and to stack on to get it to fit, right? So to get God to fit observable universe, you have to stack on an incredibly elaborate system of stuff, like motives and ideas and thoughts and things that just you can't show any basis for why those would be the case. They just are the case. So you have theoretical complexity, but the other side of it is specified complexity. And interestingly, this was a concept really seized upon and developed by creationists themselves, but it turns against them because they're right. Specified complexity is highly improbable. And that's where you have complexity. So you can have complexity, which is a giant pile of random stuff, right? So it's complex because there's a lot of it, but it's not specified. It's random. It's chaotic. But if it gets arranged in a particular way, there's only fewer ways to arrange it in that particular way out of all the possible random ways it could be arranged. So now you're creating specified complexity. The probability of that goes down and down and down because you're talking about something that just exists in that arrangement of all the random things that could exist. It's very improbable. And God, by any definition, is extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily specified, right? He's not just some random lunatic God. No, he's an absolutely perfect, infinitely perfect God, right? Infinitely wise, infinitely knowledgeable, infinitely powerful, and so on.
And as you pointed out, there are ways to detect that kind of God, in our world because it supposedly interacts with it. So obviously, you can refute a lot of that.
Yeah, and if you come up with the defense, the usual response is, well, he has some reason why he's hiding himself, right? And so, well, now you're adding, not only have you started with massive specified complexity, now you're adding theoretical complexity because you're making your theory even more elaborate than it needs to be. Whereas we can get rid of all of that and just start with a really super simple, non-specified complexity of like inflation theory, where it just starts with a very simple starting state, and you can get all observations from that without any of this specified complexity, without any of the theoretical complexity. So you just don't need God to explain anything.
Do you think things come down to like a brute fact? It just has to be, there's not necessarily an explanation like all the way down. It's just a brute fact of the universe or something like that.
So that's a possibility. So this is really a question. This is at the frontier of subatomic physics, theoretical physics. We don't know the answer to that question. And so we shouldn't pretend we know. So the question is, for philosophers, is what's possible, right? I think there probably has to be some sort of brute fact at the bottom of things, even if it's just that there was once absolutely nothing. Even that would require positing the brute fact of there once being absolutely nothing, right? So no matter how you shake it out, there's always some underlying something that is a brute fact. Now, unless we can actually come up with a proof that let's say that we can show that a naturalistic universe would arise inevitably from an absolute nothing state, which I think we can. We actually can do that. But let's just grant that for the moment. And then you say, well, then is the fact that there was absolutely nothing at one point, is that a brute fact? But it is theoretically possible to prove that it is logically necessarily the case that there had to be. Now, that hasn't been done yet. No one's done that. No one's shown a proper deductive proof that there absolutely had to be an absolute state of nothing at some point. But if they did, it's at least conceptually possible that they do it. Then we don't have brute facts at all, other than the fact that logical necessity, right? Anything that's logically necessary exists. And then that's not really so much a brute fact, because you can say, well, there is actually a tautological reason why it's not even possible for it to have been otherwise. So it's possible to not have a brute fact at the bottom of everything, but it requires a level of knowledge and proof that we haven't gotten to yet as a civilization. But it's also possible there's a brute fact. And if that's the case, the brute fact, the most likely brute fact is going to be the one that's the simplest, with the simplest specified complexity, lowest specified complexity, and the simplest theoretical complexity. That whatever brute fact that is going to be the most likely brute fact.
Yeah, but that Occam's razor, don't multiply entities or
beyond necessity. Yeah,
beyond necessity. That's not necessarily like a law of the universe. That's something that's just been continually confirmed and
reliable. Well, actually, it's an epistemic. It comes from epistemic logic, and the reason is it's not that there's some sort of law of the universe that makes things work that way. It's that the probability that things work otherwise is always lower, because if you have more components, so as you took a look at this brute fact, you have different brute facts, and you have brute facts of different complexity. The more complex your brute fact is, the less likely it would just randomly exist for no reason. And you can show this through conceptually that it's actually necessarily the case. This is a logically necessary fact. And so when Occam formed his thesis, The rule is based on, when he says beyond necessity, what he means is what is necessary to explain observation, right? So you can have a really complex explanation of something. Classic example is the periodic table, right? Compare the complete periodic table to Aristotle's theory of elements. Aristotle had 4 elements and tried to explain everything with 4 elements. Now we have over 90 elements, right? But in fact, the periodic table satisfies Occam's razor because it explains far more observations than Aristotle's does. And so the reason the periodic table is so complex is that is the least complex way that we can explain all the complexity of that we observe. And so Occam's razor is more about an epistemic logic than it is about some sort of metaphysical law of the universe. And that's revealed by the periodic table, where we have the Occam's razor result is a highly complex result. But that result is needed. It is necessary to explain the complexity of the observations we have. And there's no need, if you were to add something, take the periodic table and then add angels. Well, why do you need it? If the periodic table already explains everything, why would there be one extra thing? There's no reason for that. So you just have to assume randomly that there is. But once you start doing that, you're decreasing the probability of your theory. And so Occam's razor actually operates as an epistemic rule rather than a metaphysical one.
I'm sure you've read Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. At some point. He has his character Philo talk about or kind of postulate many different kind of imaginative, possible reasons for the world. Like the world could be a big vegetable. Like it's more likely to be a plant. He says at one point.
Right. Mm-hmm.
He says, what is this agitation of the brain that we call thought that we must make it the model of the whole universe? He gets into several, the universe could be a superorganism of a kind. There's all kinds of possibilities that don't reduce to this, theistic framework.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it becomes more obvious when you look at religious traditions outside the biblical, right? So Taoism, for example, is very much a vegetable mind universe theory. And they add more supernatural layers to that. But nonetheless, and even the Taoists, though, attribute a kind of vegetable mind to the universe.
Is that what you used to be?
I used to be a Taoist, practicing philosophical Taoist. So even they put the supernatural on they do the same thing, that there's an agent, but it is a much simpler agent than Christian theists imagine. But we can do it without the agency. We don't even need the supernatural mind of any kind, vegetable or otherwise, right? We don't need that. And we can show, and this is the thing with physicists really understand this, is how what we call physical laws and the consequences of those laws are the inevitable outcome of randomness. Right. So, the classic example is statistical mechanics, where if you put atoms in a box and they just bounce around at random, what you get are Boyle's laws of pressure and temperature, right? They just emerge inevitably from the sheer randomness. And you can do this with quantum mechanics getting up to classical mechanics, right? You can show that just the randomness of quantum mechanics actually explains a lot of the ordered behaviors at the classical level.
The way I've read a couple of books by John Joe McFadden and Jim Alcali, is how you say his name, a couple of British scientists talking about possibly biology ties into quantum physics somehow to explain some of its properties. And they made a really good point that quantum, how'd they put it? Quantum decoherence. So when you get to the macroscopic, there's quantum decoherence. So all the strangeness kind of, there's a decoherence where it becomes, it behaves like the macroscopic world does, like we know, according to Newton's laws. But do you still think that the craziness of quantum physics kind of challenges determinism at all? Are you a determinist pretty much?
I am, yeah. And I discussed this. I have a section on this in Sense and Goodness Without God for people who are interested in that.
That's a big book, and I've read it a couple times.
And my views have basically stayed the same as then, but I've become more informed. I've actually understand the science even better now than I did then, and I'm even more convinced of my position on it. But so first of all, quantum mechanics, this gets to my point about randomness. So even if you posit absolute true indeterminism, let's say quantum mechanical events, the location of the electron is of any electron is kind of random, right? There's no deterministic cause of where that electron is, except that it follows a probability law, right? So that the electron has a higher probability of being in one place than in another. And you can actually map out kind of like the cloud area of an electron based on its diminishing probability of being in a particular place. Now, this variability, this randomness of the electron is at such a small scale, like it's a trivially small scale, invisible to humans, essentially, without really advanced instrumentation.
Right.
Now, that's just a single electron. Now, if you have a billion trillion electrons, and they're all following this sort of random location rule, and then you step out and look, it's going to look exactly the same as a completely deterministic system. Because when you have randomness spread out over such a large volume, you end up getting aggregate results that are completely deterministic. And the fact that Boyle's laws and the laws of thermodynamics, the first three laws of thermodynamics, all follow necessarily from pure randomness. So even if the atoms in a box are bouncing around indeterministically, well, they are deterministically, but it's random, right? The sorting of the atoms is random. The aggregate result, because there's so many of them, and it's similar to like if you were to take, roll dice, but if you were to roll 1,000,000 dice, the total that you roll is going to really, then you get to billion dice and trillion dice, the total you roll is going to start approaching the average. And so it's going to start looking like you get the same result every time. And it'll vary at tiny microscopic bits at the edges, but the aggregate result is going to be deterministic. And this is true for classical physics. So I think even if there is quantum indeterminism, true indeterminism, its impact on the world, insofar as it matters to us, is always deterministic. So there isn't any way to get some sort of indeterministic free will out of quantum mechanics. It's not possible, because our will is a highly complex macroscopic system.
Right.
And so it's going to behave deterministically no matter what. Now, I personally suspect that there is no indeterminism underlying quantum mechanics. And this is getting into the level of philosophy of quantum mechanics, philosophy of physics. We are not at the point of really answering this question in science yet. But I think we're going to find a deterministic cause of what we observe as indeterminism. And there, I could go into the various ways that can happen. But I think that's where the science is going. But we can't prove it yet. So.
Yeah, you mentioned free will, and that's a topic that I can't even wrap my brain around. I've read about it, and I cannot get a firm grasp on what I think about it, where I stand, because you so feel you have free will, and we have will, and we make decisions, and they matter. But there's so many things that call into question at least how much freedom we have.
Yeah, and it's worth always acknowledging and being aware of the ways we are constrained, because those ways can include both physical, obviously, we have physical limitations, but also physical mental. So like we were just talking about earlier, how our brains are actually built by evolution to reason badly, right? So if you're aware of that, you can take steps to correct for it, which is an illustration of what we mean in practical sense about free will, is that we actually, because of our awareness and our ability to make decisions, we can control for the ways we're constrained. We can't eliminate them all, but we can eliminate many more of them, which we've done with technology, for example.
We evolved to reason well enough that we can survive, and that we can build tools.
We're clever. We're clever. We can actually increase our freedom in the world. Physical freedom. Technologies is massively increased human freedom compared to 40,000 years ago, right? But also politically and socially, right? Our ability to create freer societies. Now, there's limits on this, hard limits. Like too much freedom results in too much chaos, and right so you do have to have certain amounts of constraints. They're necessary for social order, but nonetheless, we can look for that optimal place, and we have the actual freedom to do that because we have self-referential consciousness. This is what allows us to do this. I mean, free will would be a whole other show. But I just did an article on this where I point out that really in the real world, like in terms of courts of law, medical ethics boards, places where the term free will actually affects human lives, there all it really means is consent, informed consent, basically. And so talking about whether free will exists or not is only talking about whether informed consent exists or not. It's not talking about whether you are disconnected from causal influences or that you have no constraints on what you can think or say or do. That's not what it's about. And so once you realize that it's actually a social concept that serves a social function, it's not a metaphysical power, then all the arguments against free will start to fall away as being trivialization of what we're actually supposed to be talking about. And for people who want to really get a sense of that, my latest article that just came out, this is for people who are watching this years from now, this would be March of 2022. I published an article on my blog at richardcarrier.info where I went into this very point.
Your blogs are always good too, and send me a link. I'd like to read that.
Okay, yeah.
But I would like to ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge for you personally, or that it causes you to pause in your naturalistic, worldview? Is it something like math or DNA? Something that could be argued. It looks like it could be a product of an intelligent mind of some kind. Something like intelligence? Or
no, I've looked really hard for that, really, really hard, and I've always found the opposite. Right? Is that there's really interesting explanations for things that don't require a God. So I've become more and more confident in my naturalism. The more I try looking for challenges to it, there just aren't any really. And I think a lot of the challenges that people find them as challenging for naturalism is because they haven't gone into the science of it, whatever it is. So they don't know what explains a certain thing. Like DNA is a classic example. Like when you really understand molecular evolution, then DNA just makes complete sense, right? There's in fact, it makes no sense coming from an intelligent engineer, but makes complete sense coming from long periods of natural selection.
What about math?
No, same thing, right? So
what do you think it is? You think it's like a language, or it's some kind of Platonic thing out there that?
Right. I'm against the Platonic mathematics. No, mathematics.
Some mathematicians aren't. They look
right.
At that
I know. Yeah. No, mathematics is a language for sure, and as such is arbitrary and invented. However, it's invented to describe a real thing. Right. So you've talked about what are the reference of mathematics. An example is numbers, right? So numbers are made up. We made those up to refer to quantities, but quantities are real. We didn't make up quantities. Right. There will always be quantities and ratios between quantities, whether humans exist or not. And there have always been throughout. So it has nothing to do with language at that level. Right. So we're describing geometry is another example. Geometry exists. Space-time can be shaped in certain ways. That's true whether the language exists to describe it or not. And what happens when you shape it certain ways follows necessarily from the structure of the thing and not from playing around with language. So mathematics in the way that we work with it is just a computational language we use to work out different possible scenarios of the structure of things. So in a sense, people who know mathematics, the theory of mathematics or philosophy of mathematics, I am very much in favor of structuralism as an explanation of mathematics, is that what we're doing is describing structures, actual and potential, hypothetical and real. And so, but the structures and the way they behave is all logically necessary, right? So that, like, you take a triangle in a flat Euclidean space, the angles will always sum to 180. However you define that, whatever words you use, the angles always come out a certain amount, which is half a circle, essentially. And so that's always true, because it's logically necessarily the case. You cannot have any possible world where that's not the case. And so you don't need Platonism either, right? You don't need any extra thing to explain why triangles are the way they are. It isn't logically necessarily the way they are, and will always be that way in every possible place. And even if you take a non-Euclidean space, triangle and warped space, well, the rules change, but they change exactly in accordance with the way you've changed the structure. And so that's what mathematics is perfectly explicable without any ghostly extra stuff.
What do you think of panpsychism?
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
I don't think there's any good evidence for it, but it's kind of interesting,
No, there's not really any evidence for it. It's pure theory, and there's different forms of it, right? So there's panpsychism in the completely ridiculous sense where everything is conscious, even rocks, right? Atoms, even electrons are conscious. That ridiculous panpsychism. Right. There's a more modest panpsychism, which is the view that qualitative experience emerges from inanimate things, so that it is at least theoretically possible for a rock to have some sort of qualitative experience but because it's so simple, the rock has no mind. It can't appreciate the experience. Now, that's at least more credible theory, but I don't think it holds up. I think there's a better form of this, which is integrated information theory, which is there's a threshold that once the complexity of an interacting information processing system, once it gets to a certain point, and not just complexity, but specified complexity, we're getting back to that. Once it gets to a certain point, then experiential qualia emerge as a phenomenon. And then the debate is, does that happen at worms? Does it happen at insects? Like, where does this start? And that we don't know the answer to, but it's not gonna be plants, right? I don't think we're gonna find evidence that plants have qualitative experience of any kind. I think the complexity has to be higher for that kind of thing to emerge. And there's the information integrated information theorists have posited a measure called phi, where you can measure this, and so so you can actually get an actual measurable number for the integrated complexity of an information system. The only thing left over is to figure out at what phi does experience emerge, and we don't know the answer to that. But I do think that there is going to be a number where it emerges, where there's a phase change essentially from inert matter to experiential existence. And so that's plausible, but that's not panpsychism, really.
Right. Before we wrap up, could you tell me, like, briefly, what do you think about consciousness? What, like briefly, like in a sentence, what do you think is the best explanation for what it is?
Well, integrated information theory, right? So when you're processing information, computing, basically, doing computations, once it reaches a certain complexity of integration of experience, and the common example is, so what our brains do is we don't just have a visual system and an audio system, auditory system and an olfactory system, and so on. We're actually integrating those and we're taking all of that information and trying to integrate it into a complete model, and then work computations using that model. We're basically simulating the universe so that we can figure it out and navigate around it. We're also, of course, human consciousness. We're simulating what our brain is doing, right? We're modeling what our brain is doing, and that's what we call consciousness. We model other minds this way too. We can model how other people are thinking by building a model in our head, running computations with it to try and calculate what happens. But once you start doing that, once you have this highly integrated information processing, the inevitable result is consciousness. So I think, like, if you were to build a computer that it could model other minds so as to predict what they're going to do and what they're thinking and so on, the inevitable outcome of that is that computer would also become conscious, because it would start modeling its own mind. Now, we haven't done that yet, and we don't know how to do that yet, but I think it's doable. I think it's inevitable that we're going to do this. And so I think that's what it is. It's just computation, but it's a computation of a particular high level and of a particular directed kind. And that's all consciousness is explained by that.
Okay. All right. So to end here, Dr. Carrier, what is your, like, sentence long or maybe paragraph long explanation for why naturalism is the best? Why naturalism is the best explanation for the world? I've heard you say, like, it's the horse that's won every race. It's
yeah, that's a good one. Right, naturalism has won every millions of races between theism or even just supernaturalism and naturalism to explain any phenomenon, right, from weather to lightning to the structure of anything, to consciousness as well. Like any aspects of consciousness, we've already gone really far in explaining a lot of why our experience of consciousness is the way it is, purely on naturalism without supernaturalism. And so if you have the same horse is always winning the race and the other horse is always losing, there's no reason to bet on that other horse, right? Like it's a loser. It's a bad explanation. Supernaturalism has become a really bad explanation for things. It predicts things poorly, whereas naturalism predicts things very well. And I think that's the ultimate reason why we have to end up there.
Yeah. Again, I can't recommend your books enough, especially those two. They're really good. Are you going to come out with a like a condensed version of Sense and Goodness at some point. I think I remember.
Yeah, I'm sort of in contract to do that. I just haven't gotten around to it. So someday, someday there will be one. Yeah.
Okay, good deal. All right. Well, again, Dr. Carrier, thank you so much for being here, for being back on the channel.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Foresight paradigm, fine. A foresight paradigm. Foresight paradigm, you fine. A foresight paradigm. I fight for sight.